real fancy. Producer. All right, guys, welcome to another episode of Fresh Brewed Kentucky Politics. I am here with Richard Hayhoe, owner of Beans, which, much like us, even more boldly, stood up against the governor. I say more boldly because I was trying to fly under the radar. He hung a banner outside his restaurant that said, "I'm open."
I'm open. We put it out on Facebook. We put it everywhere. So
yeah, there was no shame. There's no shame. And then also I'm here with Chris Wiest. Now, obviously, we're coming off of a court case we were observing here up in northern Kentucky. You can catch that on our page. We're showing that live. As always, if you want to support us, you can go to brewedco.com, BREWEDCO.com. Also donate.brewedco.com if you just want to give me money because you don't like the way I look, give me the tips, right?
And Richard, what's your website, right?
Ours is beansyall.com.
Beans Y'all. Is there a comma in y'all?
No, sir.
Beansyall.com.
Beansyall.com.
Is Richard. And Chris, if you need legal help, Chris's law firm is called Chris Wiest, attorney at law.
Yeah, it's CWIESTLAW.com. Yeah.
So anyways, we were talking a little bit beforehand, but we'll pick it back up. We'll talk about the court case here in a second. But what we were talking about was we've been getting I have been getting a lot of heat online from not so much Liberty community, some Liberty people, but also, of course, a lot of people that are enemies attempting to use our philosophy of liberty against us, a belief that government should leave you alone, by saying that, us providing, saying, hey, we need to push back on employers that are still mandating masks after the government has removed it is somehow anti-liberty. And I think it's a very obvious line for me that simply says, I can have personal views. I can lobby those personal views towards any group I want to. But the minute I ask government to enforce my personal views and my morals onto somebody else, that is crossing the line of where liberty draws a line. I don't know if you guys agree with that.
I think it's hard. I mean, you're assuming that there's no government mandate driving the train, right? Because if government's coercing employers into sort of coercing customers, that still is a government mandate, even if it's not direct. And, we're seeing some of that now, I think, with some of the vaccine mandates that are sort of, we're going to strongly encourage people. I'm the governor. I'm going to get on a phone call and sort of threaten large employers in Kentucky with vaccine mandates. You're still dealing with some level of government coercion and the power of the state. And so, I don't know that the lines are black and white in those instances. And I think that's kind of what we're transitioning into as these mandates are being lifted, is sort of government coercing employers.
Right. Do you feel, Richard, business owner? Obviously, we're business owners, restaurant owners.
Yes.
We know that there's an implied threat after the government coming off of literally being able to send. I mean, you were charged,
right?
Criminally charged for operating your restaurant. Right?
Correct.
And so being twice criminally charged. And after being criminally charged twice for operating a restaurant, I mean, there's obviously an implied threat that says they can close this at any time. I could definitely see how, if I was trying to fly under the radar and not trying to make any kind of political stance, I would be encouraging my staff maybe to get vaccinated. I could see it. Me personally, I'm pretty far away from that, even if I was exactly who I am, trying to fly under the radar. Do you understand where other employers are coming from, other business owners on it?
On what? On encouraging?
On encouraging. They feel like there's some government force there. Do you feel like there's a lot of employers out there that don't want to require the vaccine or a mask mandate to continue, but feel some social or governmental pressure?
Well, the government can apply an enormous amount of pressure. Think of the threat that they have. If there was nothing else that was shown this past 15 months, it's that we can roll over and allow the government to do whatever it is that they want to do to us. And so there's obviously a fear there. There's obviously a coercive measures that can be applied, and it takes a lot to say, hey, you know what? I'm not really going to do that right now.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to go against you. You think of the businesses that you went to, some of the early adopters, that we had mentioned before. Costco, for example, big early adopter of all things Rona related, and that was difficult. It was difficult for us personally because we loved Costco. and going in there and all of a sudden, being confronted, for lack of a better word, by the staff, it kind of is it's a different feel than what they're used to. So a lot of different businesses took a stand. Did they get that pressure before they passed on that pressure to me, or were they pushing that pressure? What came first? Mm-hmm. The corporations like Costco, or the government mandates or pressure on them? I don't know.
Well, see, and this is where I understand what you're saying about government force, but I think there's also social force. I mean, look, you have airline companies, the MLB, and beverage manufacturers saying that requiring an ID to vote is racist, right. Coming out making public statements about it. Right. That is nothing but social pressure where they think that's the right thing to say. At some point, I think we do have to kind of be creating our own social pressure, right, where we're pushing back, especially because there's a legal limit to what we can actually do, and maybe we can get to that here in a second, because I think there's a lot of myths out there, especially about like HIPAA and whether or not employers can require masks and things like that I see sometimes, and I'm like, that's not quite how the law works. But I mean, I would have to say there's got to be a lot of social pressure out there, and I think we have to start pushing back on it.
The difference between social pressure and government pressure is social pressure can be lobbied against and rallied against, and groups can come together to combat the social pressure. It's a little bit different if, let's use the governor of Kentucky's example. If you're sending state police, guys armed with guns, into an Easter Sunday church services, mm-hmm.
That's
a different kind of pressure, right?
That's a completely different kind of
pressure. Angry people on the internet. Right. So, I see them as markedly different. In the marketplace of ideas, the social pressure ultimately, I think, will work itself out. The government coercion and force is a different matter.
No, I've heard people say, though, that politics follows culture. I happen to believe it too, where if you are not fighting in the social cultural realm, if you're not pushing the Overton window in the direction you want it to go, the government will never follow in that direction. And I guess when I hear people who are liberty people say, oh, we can't use social pressure, or believe that because we believe in liberty, we're not allowed to have an opinion or even judge others. Like, I can have an opinion. I can judge others. I can rally people around a cause. I can boycott a business, right? I just can't.
And there's people that can boycott, the other way, right? There's your relatives that got mad at you and created the Boycott Brewed website, the losers that they are,
Right.
So, I think, but the beauty of that is there's a marketplace of idea. There's a free exchange of ideas, and the free market will ultimately work its way out in that scenario, right? Your 18,000 followers versus their 10 followers, that will sort itself out over time. People using armed police to sort of take away business licenses and threaten business owners with a year in jail. It's just a different animal,
right? No, completely. Now, do you feel like though? So let's talk real quick about dispelling those myths. Sure. I was talking about, Richard. Have you been hearing it? For example, we were talking beforehand about how if an employer wants to require a mask, unless you actually have an actual medical exemption from a hospital
or doctors
or doctor, like you need an actual, you can't just say you have an exemption.
If the employer demands you wear a mask, it is even after the mandates are over, an employer can demand you wear a mask as long as you don't have some sort of medical condition, and it is completely legal, right?
That's my understanding of the law. Yeah.
What about, where does HIPAA enter in that?
It doesn't. So everybody thinks HIPAA is like this magical, nobody can ever get my private health information.
I have my HIPAA badge.
And, there's a lot of sort of misconceptions about HIPAA being the shield. And HIPAA is a law that protects your health providers from disclosing your private information. But HIPAA doesn't protect you from sort of requirements, as a condition of, engaging in some activity, shopping in some place, from having to disclose that same information. And, let me give you an example, right? My kids, my son plays baseball, he plays football. He's required to get a physical every year, right? Mm-hmm. I can't sit there and scream HIPAA, HIPAA, HIPAA. I don't have to have my kid get a physical, right? That's a different animal versus, my doctor's not allowed to give out my medical records without my consent. That's HIPAA. That's what HIPAA covers. And so there's this misconception that HIPAA somehow is like going to protect you against vaccine mandates or mask mandates. And, nobody can figure out if you've, been vaccinated or not or anything like that. That just isn't true. I mean, technically people can ask. There's other laws that could sort of come into play. I mean, Title VII actually protects religious freedom. The U.S. Supreme Court has sort of taken the teeth out of that. When we sue the government, for instance, governor sending the state police in the church, there's teeth with that discrimination, right? Mm-hmm. And it, because we got court injunctions on that. But there's a different animal in the Title VII context about public accommodations and religious freedom that was put in the law, but the Supreme Court has mostly, through case law, sort of weakened that to the point that it's ineffective. There are indicators, though, that the U.S. Supreme Court's wanting to revisit that question. I mean, today they took up, perhaps revisiting Roe versus Wade, right? That's a big deal, right? They've taken up the religious freedom issue has been taken up. I don't know if a lot of people know this. There's a case right now on revisiting the religious freedom framework on whether it's discriminatory and neutral applicability, and it's sort of relevant to Kentucky in the sense that there's this whole adoption fiasco going on with the governor right now and, not honoring religious freedom. But there's a similar case out of Philadelphia where the same thing went on years ago. It's Fulton versus City of Philadelphia. It's been argued in the U.S. Supreme Court. There's going to be a decision out in the next 30 days. So we're seeing the court, and I think this is why the left is screaming court packing, because we're seeing the Supreme Court revisiting these sort of, fairly well-entrenched precedents, 15, 20-year precedents. Roe is obviously older, 73, right? It's 1973 to the day. I've done the math. It's a long time. But in the Title VII religious freedom context, that may provide protection if there's a legitimate religious belief behind a mask or an anti-vaccine. And, those are issues we're looking at. I think everyone is looking at, how is the Supreme Court going to decide Fulton as a first test case, which is going to be out in the next 30 days. I'm looking at it. I know our Kentucky Attorney General's office is looking at it because I've talked to some of the guys in the appellate section. Sort of everybody that's doing religious freedom work is waiting on this Fulton decision. But there could be religious freedoms on masks and vaccines. Everybody's kind of waiting for Fulton to see how that breaks as sort of a bellwether on the rest of the law. So there could be protections, but the law right now doesn't exactly support it.
So it's kind of unknown case law as far as that goes.
It's being developing. Yeah, it's developing as we speak. It's an exciting time to be a lawyer.
Because I know. Obviously, in the business world, we know business owners. I know business owners. I'm assuming you know other business owners.
I know a couple.
And, there's a lot of questions out there right now of not only like, what can we do, right? I mean, I've heard a lot of people talking about, can they actually ask me my vaccine status? I'm like, yeah, they kind of can. I mean, New York has a vaccine passport now called the Excelsior Pass. And they've had it for months now. Yep. I mean, it's pretty well tested. If
they may be able to ask, but that doesn't mean they can do anything about it.
Yeah, I mean, if you don't answer, what do they do then?
Well, then they could deny you service, right?
Well, maybe they can, maybe they can't. I don't know. I guess that'll be fought out at a later date. But, also through this time, we have also shown one of the reasons you mentioned that I broadcasted the fact that I was going to stay open was, well, let's see if there's any bite in that bark.
Right.
Okay? Because if I'm going to lose my shop, I'm going to lose it with my boots on.
Right.
I'm not going to lose it in the corner.
Well, that's, same with us, right?
Same with you,
yeah,
right?
Yeah, exactly.
So
same thought.
you can say a lot of things,
right?
But that doesn't mean they're going to hold up.
So, and I think that's true too. I mean, what we see time and time again, I know you see it too as you practice cases, is a lot of times, here's an example. I got sent a message the other day from a person, and they were throwing a fit because their employer had decided that vaccinated and unvaccinated people could no longer share lunchrooms together with the mask mandate listing. And so they sent out this email, they sent me the screenshots that from 11 a.m. to 2 p.m., the vaccinated people could eat in the conference room break area.
It's 6:30 in the morning.
Everybody else. And unvaccinated people, just screw you, you're either eating early or eating late, right? And they're like, this is discrimination and everything else. And I'm like, well, before I even pass any cases on to any lawyers I know, let me ask you, are you really willing to take it far enough to take it into court? And they're like, no, I don't want to rock the boat that much.
I see that. The other interesting thing is with the employer mandates, and, I've been looking at Senate Bill 5, the Senate Bill 5 issue, the legislature gave COVID immunity to businesses, and I thought that was really interesting. So if I go and I get a COVID vaccine, and I think, I know I've not hidden the fact that I made the personal decision to go out and get a vaccine. Actually, I did it.
And I've heard that means we can't be near you because you're like shedding.
I'm
You're going to make me start.
I'm not shedding. I've looked at the science behind it.
Have you
we've done vaccine. That's the funny part, right? I mean, if you're doing vaccine rights work, and I've been doing it for a couple of years. We did the chickenpox case in Boone County on the schools that were shut down. That means that everybody gets to make their own decision, in my view, and that means that I get to make my decision for me, and I respect the ability of people who want to say no, make the decision for them. And I think, fundamentally, that's personal autonomy and freedom. And I wish people would be a lot more respectful on both sides of it, right? The people that are screaming, you're killing grandma if you don't get vaccinated. And there are some people that want to scream, well, if you got vaccinated, you're going to die of the plague and whatever else. And I'm like, you know what? Like, how about you respect my decision? I'll respect yours, and we'll all be a lot better off. And there's a disconnect on sort of those edges. But I look at this, and we've written letters. I don't think it's a big secret. We wrote a letter to Berea College over the EUA, the Emergency Use Authorization, which is what this is approved under right now. And you look at the federal law behind that, and that letter went out with Aaron Seary. Aaron's been doing a ton of vaccine rights work. He's probably one of the most preeminent attorneys in the country in the vaccine rights world. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. gets a lot of the press, and I saw somewhere somebody called him the most prolific sort of spreader of vaccine lies, and I laughed. RFK Jr. But actually, Aaron's been really leading the charge. He's the law firm's out of New York. But he's got offices in Arizona, Florida. I mean, they've got offices all over the country. And Aaron and I have been doing work together for a while. Aaron's view of the world. I don't know if a lot of people know this. I'm sure Aaron is not liked in some circles because Aaron's done multiple petitions to the FDA to slow down the vaccine rollouts, require them to look at more data. Did multiple petitions. I think he's going to do the same thing on the final vaccine approval. There are rights that we believe, and I think the law leads to this conclusion that says no one can mandate, no one could coerce the vaccines right now. I know some employers we're looking at lawsuits. The problem is, and it's really, it sort of goes into the issue with the governor's mandates. The clock is ticking, and those vaccines are going to get full approval probably. Pfizer's already filed for their full approval, 30, 60 days, maybe 90 days on the outset. Nobody's getting a lawsuit done in 90 days, right? No one. So, what good's that going to do? It's a temporary victory, even if you stop it. And so I do think the full approval is coming. And unless there's mechanisms in state law that protects you against employer mandates, and we don't have any in Kentucky, other than maybe the Title VII religious angle, there's just not a lot you can do.
Now, here's an interesting question. I'm curious to know how you guys feel about it. So you just mentioned outside of some sort of exemptions, things like that. Now, my immediate, and this is, people kill me all the time for this because I'm a stickler for this. My immediate reaction is I don't actually personally want there to be laws mandating what business owners do, only because I'm coming off of fighting the government, or coming off of fighting the government about doing something with our business we don't agree with. If on the flip side, just because that person doesn't agree with me, but they want to do something with their business, I don't know. And also, too, are we opening up a Pandora's box of okay, well, the businesses, the minute we say the government can come in and somehow legislate what you mandate or can't mandate in your business, are we opening up the Pandora's box as far as vaccines go? Of them being able to come in, they may come in and say, you don't have to require this one. Are we opening up an alley for them to come in and say, but now we do have this one down the road you can now require by inviting government in at all into the argument?
Employers for years, the federal government requires some, safety standards. We had an expert talk about it today, OSHA, in a lot of the business context, OSHA applies. There's always been some level of regulation of business, right? You can go back to Title VII and the Civil Rights Act of 1965 to end, segregation, and which began, frankly, because of government mandates. It's why it began, and probably needed, in my opinion, it needed government action to end what the government began, and sort of fixing the government's ills that the government created. But I don't know if I'm willing to say that there's absolutely no role for government in the business context, particularly the things that I'm the most supportive of are disclosure requirements, right? If I'm going to be, look at House Bill 1. We talked about it today, right? You go and you both did it. You both posted a House Bill 1 plan on your door. I think
And my
that's
website.
in your
On your
website.
website.
On the website, yeah.
On your website.
And I think it's a great piece of legislation in the sense that I can go and look before I walk into your business and figure out what you're doing and what you're not doing.
Gives you complete
It
freedom
gives
of
me
choice.
complete freedom of choice because the customer freedom of choice, and it's a disclosure. I think fundamentally those kinds of requirements are not bad requirements.
Mhm.
You know, I mean,
So you're saying as long as before you get employed, they disclose everything, you agreed upon it upon employment, it's...
Upon employment, but what happens when they change it partway
So
through?
yeah, so you're talking earlier. What were you talking about earlier?
So, I don't know what the current law in the state is. Maybe you can talk to that. I don't know. But if I go and I hire you under this set of parameters, and this set of pay, and this kind of vacation, and these other things, and I bring you on board, and all of a sudden I make all those changes, there's probably grounds for some kind of civil action or action by you against me as the employer because I hired you under this, and now I need this. So
Some sort of contract law thing there.
yeah. So generally speaking, you can change the terms and conditions of employment in Kentucky for any reason or no reason at all, with exceptions, right? I mean, there's exceptions. There's sort of public interest exceptions. There's the race, sex, age discrimination. Things that employers can't do. But generally, in the absence of an actual written contract of employment, you're entitled in Kentucky to set the terms and conditions of employment, and the employers are entitled to change it. And it's called.
But if you have a rope contract,
and if you have a written contract, now you're stuck.
Now you're stuck. Okay, so
okay,
assuming we have a written contract with my compensation and my vacation time all lined out and everything like that,
and all of a sudden I come along and say you need a vaccine and you need this and you need that. Well, I don't know if I have a right to that except to redo the contract.
Mhm.
And to redo the contract would typically require a readjustment in the salary or payment or whatever that is. There's there must be an Amber Alert on something going
Some
on.
kid going missing? What's
No,
going
my
on?
wife's like,
It's like, what are you doing? I'm watching you live, and why are you still
Right.
at the office? Like,
leave those guys alone. Anyway, sorry. Go ahead.
so, that's I don't know where I was going. So,
Well, no.
Back to you.
Earlier you'd said there was an employer you'd heard of that was
well, Delta is now
Delta.
saying new employees, they're going to require new employees to get vaccinated prior to employment. So their union is probably saying, hey, you can't tell our other guys.
with their union, right? I don't know.
There's
how
probably
much
a
vaccine-
contract there. Like you said, there's some kind of contract. There's some kind of agreement between the employee and the employer,
Yeah, what
definitely
happens with
through
that?
a union.
What if a union does come in and say, okay, all of our union, like can a union, so like UAW, right? Can they come in and say, all right, we agree that all our people have to be vaccinated in order to work there. Can they do that?
So it depends on the union contract, the terms of the union contract with the employer. You have to look at the collective bargaining rights within those contracts and see,
So it's possible.
it's possible. You got to, I mean, it's all very
Ain't
factual.
that some union BS right there? Yeah, collective bargaining really biting you in the butts, guys. Come on now. One size fits all policies. Get me again.
Yeah.
So anyway, sorry about the preamble stuff. The reason why we gathered though here today was because I'd watched you guys in court, and it was, what's the name of the case?
It was Ridgeway Properties LLC doing business as Deans versus, at this point, the style of the cases versus Andy Beshear, the governor of Kentucky.
Okay. And so the nature of this case, correct me if I'm wrong, is this had started out as an original case
Right.
that was pleaded through, and then with the passage of HB1, SB1, and SB2, it changed the layout of the case.
So we did this case, Richard knows, last summer. Late hearing. I think we went till like 10 p.m. at night. And, we tried this case last summer, and I went up to the Kentucky Supreme Court, and they said everything the governor did under 39A was lawful, and 39A was not unconstitutional. And for the most part, other than one exception, the governor's orders were not unconstitutional. And they did find one of his orders unconstitutional, but he had changed it in the meantime. So they said that part of it was moot, and he already got what he wanted on that issue. He had prohibited last summer at venues, parents sitting next to their kids. The parents had to sit 6 feet away from their 2-year-olds, and we challenged that as being arbitrary, and the Supreme Court did agree with that. But other than that, everything got upheld, and so that was the style, and it came back down. And
Was that really a rule?
Oh yeah, that was the rule.
That was really a
Dr.
rule.
At the Florence Speedway.
At the Florence Speedway, Dr. Stack called it an imperfection in the rule. So that was.
It was really a rule that
really
I had to put my little 2-year-old over here.
Yes.
And I'd see him 6 feet away from him.
Right.
And if my kid came running at me, what was I supposed to do?
I guess-
6 foot
I guess-
stick? You'd be like, stay
No,
away.
I guess you went to jail, right to jail, and so did the business. Right
to jail. Everyone's
Right
going
to
to
jail.
jail. Everybody's held accountable.
Right
This
to jail.
2-year-old
Yeah.
can't be running around.
2-year-old too close, right to
Too
jail.
close.
2-year-old too far, right to jail. Right. Those were the requirements. So,
You had to
So-
get grabber hands. Can you imagine changing a diaper, though?
I'm not sure how one would have to change a diaper that way.
You have
CPS
12
was-
kids, right? How many kids
CPS
do you
was
have?
watching while you were,
Right.
make sure it wasn't 7 feet, because then CPS would,
Right.
that would be
No,
abandonment.
that's too far now. Here, that's neglect. How many kids do you have?
I don't know. What's
8.
Eight. I keep saying
and
12.
three grandchildren.
So it went, that case went up to the Kentucky Supreme Court, and then it came back down. And what was curious to me, and I'm surprised the governor's office didn't do this. They never moved for final judgment to have the judge, when the record came back from the Supreme Court, to dismiss the case, right? So there was this open case that was sitting there while the legislature passed all this legislation, and I'm like, you don't say. Let's go and amend the complaint to deal with all the new legislation. And as you're aware, I tried to get you in. The judge said no on you coming in, but did say obviously Richard was entitled.
That's
to
all
it.
right. Richard can represent us.
Richard did well today.
I'll represent.
He did well today testifying.
He did well today, I thought.
Now, I think it's important there to pause. The reason why having an open case that you could refile in was important was to ensure that the case couldn't be kicked over to Judge Shepard in Franklin County Court.
So that
right?
was one of the concerns. This was the other point. And you, just as a practical matter, the reason why, I thought about just filing a new case. It wouldn't have been a big deal. I could have filed it in Campbell. We would have done a good trial. Judge Strong Campbell could have done, either of the judges in Boone would have been fine too. We had put on, Richard's aware of this, probably 12 to 14 hours of testimony, expert testimony, economic testimony, the whole 9 yards last summer, right? And so my sense of it was the judge is entitled for final judgment to rely on that testimony. And I wanted all that in the record if this thing's going back up to the Supreme Court, rather than having to reinvent.
So it's more about you already had a good basis of evidence.
I felt that way, and we had already done a whole lot of work. The governor's office had done a lot of work. There was just a lot of that work had already been done on some of this stuff, and so I felt like today we were going to put Richard back on. We're going to talk about the new mandates, and we were going to put some expert testimony on. I'm not sure the governor's office was quite ready for that today. So we put 2 experts on, as you saw. We put a medical doctor on to deal with the COVID mandates and sort of the lack of the science behind it, and then the industrial hygienist that dealt with the mask mandate and how that was basically ineffective because the COVID's actually aerosols and it's ineffective. And so, I'm not sure they were quite ready for that.
Now, obviously, going into the case, the first witness you called was Richard here.
No, the first witness we called was State Representative
Jason Nemes.
And what I was trying to do was get him to talk about all of the rational basis behind the legislation.
Now, we don't. Well, I'll speak for me. I'm not a big fan of Nemes.
I know.
But I think.
So here's my thing with Jason. And Jason and I have been friends. I have tried cases against Jason in court. I have. Friends. Jason and I. Jason. It does not mean that I have to disagree with. It does not mean that I agree with him on every political stance that he takes. And, Jason's in a purple district. And, Jason is not as far right as I am. But, there's just there's not a lot of Republican lawyers out there. Most of the lawyers are dyed-in-the-wool Democrats.
Isn't Ed Massey, though,
a
lawyer?
I think he is a lawyer, and I think he says he's Republican. So that's
he says he's Republican. That's for sure.
So we can but there's not, and I don't have a personal relationship with Ed because I've not really had a case against Ed. Jason and I, we've tried cases against each other for a week in federal court, and we've just battled it out. And I think Jason's a good trial lawyer. I don't agree with Jason on impeachment. I don't agree with Jason on. I don't think the legislature went far enough in dealing with the governor. There's a lot of things I disagree with the legislature on and Jason on, sort of on the politics. But we're, Jason and I are personal friends, and we have a decent personal relationship. I have cases against his law firm right now, and. That is what it is. But Jason was going to come in and testify today that basically there was a rational basis in competing concerns.
Do you like Jason?
Behind each and every piece of legislation. And I thought actually having Jason elicit that testimony, sort of being the purple moderate Republican, might have been helpful.
So you're calling him to testify on what the law is supposed to do?
what it was, and the considerations that went into passing it, the multiple considerations, that it wasn't just about sort of COVID and not recognizing the economic and secondary effects that the legislature was dealing with. Judge shut all that down. Judge is like, look, there's a rational basis, and you guys can just argue it, and that's good enough.
Well, and I think
the judge was right.
Before we get into the witnesses a little bit more, though, I think too what's important is to understand, because a guy that was with me, he had asked me for leaving. He's like, what exactly was being argued in that case? And so, correct me if I'm wrong, what was exactly being argued was that Richard here is still having mandates pushed on him that are being passed illawfully. The governor's defense to that was medically it's necessary to do so for the greater good.
Right. Grandma's going to die if he doesn't
defines it, right?
Right.
If you sell one more donut, it's a delicious donut. But if you sell one more of it, grandma's dying. It's not because she's diabetic. Right. It's because you gave her COVID. Right. And so that's kind of goes into the argument of, okay, so first you called Jason Nemes up to kind of, you wanted to frame in what the law is supposed to do, what were they considering, and then you had two Richard was second. Then you had two other expert witnesses to actually testify on is COVID killing everybody? What's the deal with the mask?
If all the governor's mandates go away, is grandma going to die?
Because that was the governor's defense to why he still needed to make mandates.
Well, and more importantly, right, if you look at what happened in the Scott Circuit Court, right, I mean, I think Judge Privet was absolutely right on the law. I think the law is constitutional. I think the governor's constitutionality arguments are absurd. But what the Court of Appeals did, basically, was said, you know what? We're not even going to deal with this law thing right now. We're just concerned that grandma's going to die if we don't stop Judge Privet's dangerous order. Mm-hmm. And so I felt like we had to go today at this narrative that this fear that they've been peddling for a year and a half about grandma's going to die and they're saving Kentucky, and debunk it with real science and have that in, because that's really difficult for a Court of Appeals judge or, frankly, the Kentucky Supreme Court to look at it and say, you know what, Judge Brueggemann, hopefully he's going to enter findings that our experts were credible and that their testimony was reliable and that, that this is all nonsense. That's a really hard finding to upset in the Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court. And so my thought process in going into today's hearing was, it's not just about the law. I'm going to deal with the equities because I'm sick and tired of this narrative, the fear of, Andy's saving Kentucky and everybody's going to die. And I felt like we had to address it, and I think we did.
So we had Jason Nemes come up, but they objected, were able to exclude Jason Nemes from testifying.
Yeah.
And then Richard came up, and Richard, you had to testify that you could read. Now, was that difficult for you?
It took a minute.
You had to struggle your way for it.
Well, that's because our argument has been business owners can't read the CDC guidance and figure out for themselves what a safe plan is.
So what they say is that, and what's funny is they say we business owners cannot possibly read the CDC guidelines with advice of an expert if we want to hire one, such as an attorney, to help decipher through what you have to do and not to do. And we can't possibly figure out on our own how to make HB1 work. Now, Richard, did you figure your way through HB1?
It's amazing. I have a much higher vested interest in my business than any government entity.
Really?
Believe it or not.
That is shocking. That is breaking news. Richard cares more about his business than Andy Beshear does.
Believe it.
You know what's funny about it? Because, and I don't, hopefully Richard is okay with me discussing how we got to his House Bill 1 plan and the conversation we had. It's privileged. If you don't want to talk about it, we don't have to talk about it, but I think it's interesting. They didn't ask about it, but I'm okay talking about it if you are, the back and forth that we had and getting to that plan.
I asked for your help to develop it. And
so I went through the CDC guidance. I did the same thing with you, as you know, and I listed every single requirement, and we had a conversation about what can you live with, what can't you, and why.
He had to read it to me.
He did read it to you?
Yeah.
Well, those Canadians, they read in French. So for those who don't know, Richard,
so here's what's funny, right? If you look at his House Bill 1 plan, one of the first requirements is we'll comply with all the Kentucky food safety requirements. And the reason for that is, and I think that might be in yours too, I don't remember. But I went through all these CDC stuff, and Richard's like, that's already required.
Yeah.
And he's like, I have to do all this anyways. And I'm like, well, if we took out,
I think we had the same conversation too. Like it's all like they clearly never ran a restaurant. Like
I'm like, what do you have to do in addition to comply with CDC? And that's what's in this plan, other than the very first requirement in this plan, which says I'm going to comply with the Kentucky food safety requirements.
Now, and I want to pause on food safety requirements. Now, Richard, do you follow the food safety requirements because the health department might come into your business twice a year?
I follow it because I follow best practices for my restaurant and for the safety of my staff, customers, you name it.
So you do not do it because Karen from the health department, which was the name of my health department inspector, that wasn't a joke.
Mine was, mine was Jay last year.
Jay, okay.
Yeah.
Well, so it's not because they might show up twice a year.
No, it's not.
And do an inspection. It's because you don't want your customers to be sick.
It's because I care about my product and my staff and my
Shocking.
And my product and what I'm producing. I actually want my people to enjoy themselves at my restaurant.
So you mean to tell me
in return,
Richard,
healthy,
who stayed open, is a responsible business owner?
Yeah.
I can't believe what I'm hearing.
Well, that's the thing. It was,
and that is how the testimony went.
It really is.
Right.
The point that Dr. Stack was making was that unless they mandate uniformity between 120 counties, he referenced chicken. The chicken has to be baked at the same temperature across the state. And as if that has anything to do with the 120 counties that are all different. There are varying amounts of density and population in Louisville as there is in other counties. And so it is not a unilateral application of the rules and the mandates. They are specific and they should be held as such in different areas of the city.
Well, I think taking the chicken example, the perfect example of this would be the rule on chicken is a guideline that says you have to serve chicken at X amount. Now, it's not like like going back to the Parks and Rec quote, undercooked chicken, straight to jail. Overcooked fish, straight to jail. Undercooked, overcooked. But it is based on a temperature guideline, so you know not to get people sick, right? However, it's not a cook time guideline because we all cook chicken differently in a restaurant depending on our application. Could be deep frying it, could be baking it, could be frying it on a pan. You could be doing all kinds of weird things. You could be cooking it over an open fire. I don't know what you're doing there. But
what weird things would you do with chicken?
Right. Well, I do live in. No, I'm just joking. Anyway, so the point is, though, is the guideline.
Maybe a turducken.
The guideline is.
Turducken it?
I could shove it up in there. Anyways, but the guideline is based around an idea that everybody cooks chicken differently.
Right.
But the COVID guidelines are not built around an idea that everybody's space is different. For example, not to offend you, but one could say that my space, where it has a garage door and 2 front doors and create a lot more airflow than perhaps your space could, should maybe be treated differently if we're worried about an airborne pathogen that spreads by not circulating air, right?
It's amazing. The expert today, the IH expert, talked about just that as being the appropriate control versus masks and all this other nonsense of opening the windows, of increasing airflow, of destruction. And, we've been dealing with government mandates and the fear being pushed all along, as opposed to the scientists sitting down and saying, wait a minute, we've been dealing with exposures to diseases and asbestos and everything else for 60 years, and how have we dealt with it? And it's always sort of been this hierarchy of controls that you've heard the expert talk about today. And it's interesting to hear people that have been dealing with this for 60 years sort of apply known principles. And we've been off the reservation for a year.
Right. No, we have been for sure. So your testimony, we discover that Richard can read.
Yeah, I was able to read. I was able to point to things. I was able to communicate back.
That's important stuff. That is important stuff. Yeah. It's almost as if, and that's one of the things too, where if your survival depends upon it, you're going to figure out how to read the CDC guidelines pretty quickly.
Yeah, I'm going to figure out how to do it responsibly and correctly and to the best of my ability.
So as Dr. Stack said in his testimony, you do not need Dr. Stack, the ER doctor, to read the CDC guidelines and then translate them for you.
No, I do not.
So you can understand them.
No, but I think what he was meaning was that his guys have a hard time reading my plan.
Oh, okay.
Wasn't that what he said?
He did say something
Because
like
he
that.
said he doesn't want different plans on everybody's door.
Right, because they would
Right?
have a hard time.
So maybe they had the hard time reading.
Also,
maybe
too,
he wasn't referencing my hard time reading. Maybe it was to protect his guys.
Well,
You mean the guys that come up with the plan that parents couldn't sit 6 feet or within
Those
6 feet of
guys.
their kids?
Yeah.
Couldn't figure out how to read the CDC guides? I'm shocked.
Yeah.
Well, hold on. Are these the same people that when we were getting a mask violation, they came in and I called you? I'm like, hey, we're getting a mask violation right now. And you're like, ask them what rule you're breaking. So I said, what rule am I breaking? They're like, well, that person's not wearing a mask. I'm like, oh, how do you know they don't have an exemption? They're like, oh, you're not allowed to have an exemption. I was like, where does that say that in
I remember that
anything?
conversation.
And what she presented to me was an internal email from like Felicia. And I'm like, I don't know Felicia. Who's Felicia? And she's like, well, that's my boss. I'm like, that's cool. It looks like she's emailing you something. That doesn't seem publicly available to me. So, these are the same people that are making policy decisions of how it's implemented in the field.
You obviously missed that 4:00 podcast.
That's what it was.
Felicia's
It was an
4 o'clock
announcement.
podcast.
Felicia announcing to everybody, this is how we're forcing these
I remember the cross-examination of the lady, and I'm like, well, how do you know an exemption doesn't apply? And she's like, I don't. So I'm like, so as you sit here today, you don't know whether or not he was in fact in violation of you. Well, no. And it was this meek, like, I've been caught with my hand in a cookie jar. Kind of like we saw with Dr.
Right.
I think we saw some of that today.
Well, yeah, we definitely have. So we get through Richard's thrilling, riveting testimony where we find out he can read. And that's really like, if I was you up there, I don't know how you weren't flipping things. I'm like, this is kind of insulting to my intelligence for a second.
But like the governor spent 8 pages arguing restaurant owners can't read.
Right.
I mean,
right.
that was brief. So it had to get addressed.
It did. It did have to be addressed. So we did cover the fact that restaurant owners can in
read.
fact.
Yeah, I was cramming last night for it.
Were you?
Yeah. Trying
real hard. Pulling out your Hooked on Phonics.
Yeah.
French to English translation guide.
Yeah.
Anyway, so Richard gets done, and then we call up Dr. Molly Rutherford. So real quick, wow, I don't know about you, but we're sitting there, you're sitting there, and we're hearing her background. And me and producer Nick are next to each other, and our mouths are just dropping. So to understand this, real quick, what is this doctor's specific qualifications?
So she, before she went to medical school, got a master's in public health, worked for the National Institute of Health on public health matters, including worked right for Dr. Fauci for like 3-4 years.
So she said she briefed Dr. Fauci.
Right.
Preparing him for testimony for 3-4 years at NIH. And we're like, okay, go on.
She's preparing what he then
communicated
says, to the Senate or Capitol,
right.
I think she meant.
So she's got a master's in public health, and she's got a medical doctorate. She's the immediate past president of the Kentucky, I think it's the Family Physicians Association. It's all the family docs in the state. I mean, she's published on COVID treatment. I mean, she's a legit expert.
Well, they tried to tell her she wasn't because she hasn't done epidemiology work in like 10 years.
Oh, that
even
was
though
my favorite comeback when I'm like, I don't think there's a shelf life, Your Honor, on experts.
That was funny, but at the same time, it's funny to hear her say, in fact, I've treated COVID patients. And then what's even funnier, though, is as they're saying this, Dr. Stack, who's been making our healthcare policy advising, has never treated a COVID patient. Right. Is a ER doctor, which is very similar to a family kind of practice doctor,
right?
With no master's in public health, never worked in epidemiology, right. But apparently
he's a donor.
He can set policy. He does donate.
He does donate to Governor Beshear.
So is that the qualification that would have got her passed?
Well, as you're aware, the judge ultimately accepted her as an expert.
Yeah, no, she did get accepted as an expert, but would that have
who was not proffered as an expert today was Dr. Stack. I thought that was really interesting.
No, he was not proffered as an expert.
I thought that was a bold move, Cotton, on the part of the governor's office.
It was very bold for them to come right out during the trial and say, no, he's not an expert on COVID, which made me be like, why are we all here today? Right. But, so Molly comes up and...
She's fantastic.
Fantastic testimony, just completely...
Basically, lockdowns actually are ineffective. Mandates are ineffective. They may help flatten the curve and reduce ICU sort of percentages, but they actually have an potentially inverse effect on the number of deaths and could increase the number of deaths. And I thought that was, she had the studies behind her for that. And I do think we're learning more about this. We have been learning more about this, over the last year. I think everybody went into this in March of 2020, and I mean, I gave the governor a month and a half before I started suing him, right? Because nobody knew, and I felt
That was
like
kind of
nobody
you.
knew.
That was good.
And then it was just about him sending the state police to church, right? I thought that was really bad. I thought that was bad for him. But but I thought her testimony. Nobody's gone into court and challenged all this stuff with medical and scientific testimony in my experience until today.
Yeah.
And we've gone and we've argued law, and arguing law is great.
Mhm.
As we saw in Scott County with the Kentucky Court of Appeals, arguing law wasn't enough. I felt like we had to challenge the science and just show that really they're not really saving anybody. I mean, look, and intuitively we all know that, right? I mean, you go down to Florida, the body bags aren't lining the streets in Florida. So,
well, and not only that, but I mean, I think I probably started saying it 8-9 months ago.
Right.
Where I started looking around, and we work in restaurants, so we know that the restaurant industry is a common place for people going through recovery to find work. Have you ever done any second chance employment before?
Second chance employment. Yeah, we have. We work with the ministry right now that we hire guys from.
Yeah, and we ourselves, Brewed has done it a couple of times, but another company I deal with, we've done it probably 100, 200 employees, and we've kind of gone through second chance employment of to the point where we are going literally to recovery clinics and setting up recruitment tables to bring them in. And so, that's an example. So, and the reason why I bring that up is Molly was hitting upon how a lot of people were overdosing and people she knew overdosing,
suicides, depression. Yep.
And that's where specifically, if you come in with the scalpel and look at it, and I fully believe, because there's even ministries all around that deal with restaurants and people in recovery, just because the nature of it, it's not super high risk. You don't got to worry too much about theft. Especially if they're like serving, they keep their own book. They don't have access to a till, cooks, workers, things like that. So you've got a low chance of any kind of flare-ups that are becoming a problem. But I fully think a good chunk of the overdoses that have occurred in Kentucky is thoroughly due to the targeting of restaurants and bars. I think it's especially restaurants. The serving jobs, the cook jobs that all went away, things like that. I don't know if you would agree.
I mean, the other side of it, right? I mean, this was the reason I was so hot over the school issue, and I got into it with the state representative and other things. When they had the kids doing NTI, right? Parents got to stay home with them. Well, guess who's not working then, right? And there's, there are all of these sort of trickle down effects that people suffer that nobody sort of thinks about. Look at this unemployment thing with the add-on payment, right? I mean, I'm guessing both of you guys are probably to some degree having problems with staffing right now. And, nobody sits there and says, well, you know what, if we're paying people, almost as much to go to work as we are to stay home, maybe people won't go to work, right? Like nobody's sitting there looking at this and saying, well, what are the secondary effects of this stuff? And I feel like,
well, why aren't they doing that? Is that really how it works?
I think it is.
Well, it just doesn't quite add to the 4:00 propaganda hour.
I think it's a confirmation bias. I think it is they're doing the things they already want to do, and they only want to listen to the experts that will support them in doing what they already want to do. And if you're an expert, and right now who's in power is the Democrats mostly, and you want funding from them for your research, you better be telling them what they want to hear. And I think sitting there and pretending for 5 seconds things like science and research is not political is completely incorrect. Not to go way off into the weeds, but my sister's actually an RD, a registered dietitian, has her master's in dietetics, things like that. And there's a giant study they look over about the food pyramid and how, if you remember, the food pyramid got reorganized, right, out of the normal triangle into the slices.
Michelle.
Right. That food pyramid had actually, for like decades, registered dietitians have been saying this is a bad food pyramid. This is the correct food pyramid. But because these people that were making these bad food pyramids were telling the government what they wanted to hear, they were the ones the government was funding. It was this whole idea about fat and cholesterol. I don't know. She explains it better. But long story short, the point is RDs all know this from nutrition research that if you want funding, you better tell the government what you want to hear. And it's the same thing with, I feel like a lot of these scientists are saying exactly what you want to hear. I mean, there was one point where Dr. Stack he came out and he said he was questioned about people being, by the AG's office, about people being vaccinated or having had COVID. And he just says, like, with full certainty, like, no, you need to be vaccinated. Vaccines are better than
It's a greater, provides a greater protection against
COVID. Yeah,
against
it was
COVID
like
than
shadow of a doubt.
already having had.
And when the
So what's
Attorney General-
interesting, so I've been all over the literature. There are a couple studies that say that, and there are a couple of studies that say it's the same. And in fact, Dr. Rutherford put on a study, I don't know if you caught it today, one of hers was it's the same immunity.
Right. And that's what's interesting is he says that with full
Right.
science authority, and then when the AG's office says, where's the study behind it, all he can say is, well, the CDC's website.
Right.
So you have...
And if you actually go into the PubMed, which are the medical literature on it, and we did, there's a divergence of authority. And, I found it interesting that he wasn't even willing to acknowledge the divergence of authority, especially having just presented into evidence one of the studies that suggested it was the same.
Right.
It's accepted into evidence today.
Right. And that's where I don't understand where, not only that, but take what Dr. Stack is doing. He is supposed to be the lead person advising the governor on the mandates and what his messaging should be and everything else. And you mean to tell me you have never read the source material on whether or not vaccines offer greater, the same, or less immunity than actually having caught COVID would?
So the problem is if he would have acknowledged which study it was, then Vic, who was doing the questioning, would then be able to pull that study out and cross him with it. And so he was making the decision to be sort of vague about it rather than exposing himself to getting beaten up with it. I think that's what was going on.
So you're saying the science was bad?
I'm saying that there's flaws in certain of those studies that suggest that natural
Immunity is
immunity,
the same.
and it's not actually the same immunity. The science is that it's a different kind of immunity because if you get actual exposure, right, you're not just getting the spike proteins that you're getting in the vaccine. You're also getting the nucleus. You're getting different parts of it. And what we're increasingly, I think, what the science is showing on the emerging studies are that the T cell response, as opposed to just the pure antibodies, the T cell response from the natural immunity may be higher than the vaccine, whereas the vaccine is sort of priming you to protect against the spike proteins. Doesn't mean that one's better than the other. It means they're both effective. It's just different.
Well,
and I think that science is still coming out on that.
Well, and I think, though, intuitively we realize it by looking just simply at the numbers. I mean, by the numbers, if the vaccine's the only thing providing us close to herd immunity, we shouldn't be anywhere close to herd immunity. I mean, they said herd immunity would be
like they are.
No,
right?
I mean, they said herd immunity
dropping.
should be like 80% vaccinated. We're at 50, and we're down to...
So Andrew, it's interesting. I don't know if you caught this with my cross of Dr. Stack, but we have vaccinated 80% of the adults over 65 in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. And it just so happens, I think it's something like 90% of the people that have died from this are that in that age group.
Sure.
And so we've sort of done what some people have said we should have done all along, which is protect that vulnerable population. Once you've done that, there's no need for any more mandates ever again, to the extent there ever was. And obviously we put on proof today that there wasn't. But I mean, we're there, and this stuff should have been lifted.
Oh, well, we were there 3 months ago, right? I mean, as soon as it's correction. I mean, a lot of these things, especially restaurant closures, never made any sense at all. And it's certainly my point I was getting to earlier.
KRA just didn't donate enough to the Beshear governor.
That's got to be what it is. But my point I was getting to earlier is when you look at, I think restaurants in particular, I've read a few studies, obviously, about what the closures of restaurants did. One of them stated, and it's funny, too, how the CDC words this. They said, study proves that closure of restaurants saved lives. But when you go look at the study, it's like a 2%, after 100 days after opening or closing, a 2% difference in death rate growth was discernible. And so, sure, it saves lives, but it saves like 10 lives. Like it wasn't saving a bunch. Maybe. But more importantly, going back to the overdosing side of things, part of recovery is finding meaning. And you find meaning through work and through your religion. And so you're closing churches down, you're closing restaurants down, and you're leaving them out to dry.
Right.
And you don't even bother to look for 1 second and say, hey, how many people are we killing? How many people are surviving? To the point that when Dr. Stack was questioned about that, Of course, now we put out the photo where he's just texting his phone as he's hearing about it in the courtroom. He doesn't care. But when he's questioned about it, he says, no. Our lockdowns didn't kill people. Lockdowns didn't even exist. There was no lockdown to begin with, by the way. But
how about the part from the cabinet lawyer? Well, we never shut down restaurants and schools.
oh my gosh, I had a little outburst in court. I was like, unbelievable. I forget what I said. I was like, come on. I pulled Joe Biden there. But more importantly, though, come on, man, that's ridiculous. But more importantly, when asked about it, he simply stated our lockdowns didn't do it. COVID has a lot of victims, just not from COVID.
Yeah.
And I'm like, when's the last time you heard a flu season and then be like, well, these car accidents, people sneezing while driving is causing these car accidents. Flu causes car accidents. No, right? Like, that's a crazy connection to make. And so he's saying COVID killed the people because I need to sleep at night. Yeah. And if I think for 1 second that me telling him to close down restaurants actually has resulted in more people dying than it would have saved, I might feel like the jerk I am and resign my position.
Yeah, good luck with that.
But, as long as he's lying to himself, it's okay. So Molly comes up, does a fantastic job of getting clearly across that the mandates are killing, in her opinion, mandates were killing more people.
Maybe not statistically significant, but it's at least a wash, if not mandates killing.
Right. And that she, in her expert opinion, believes that to be the case. Right. And on Cross, it seemed like the governor's attorney's office, they had some lines there that they kind of attacked her on, per se, trying to make her look not as credible. But what's interesting is they never challenged her actual opinions, per se.
So, I thought she did fine handling the governor's office's Cross. And as a trial lawyer, and I think guys that try cases will tell you this, if somebody's crossing your witness, you get back up to do the redirect if you can fix it and you need to fix it, right? If you can and you need to. And so if the witness has done pretty good on cross, you don't need to get back
right.
up. And if the witness is so horrid that there's nothing you can do to ultimately fix it, you don't get back up to expose them to more beating. And so, you get back up in that middle ground of where you can fix it. Dr. Rutherford, I didn't get back up because I felt like she made the case she needed to make, and I thought she did just fine on cross.
Yeah, I thought so. You're in the courtroom too, Richard. What'd you think?
Yeah, I thought she did great. Yeah, she did a great job. I liked her testimony. She was very methodical and in what she had to communicate, and she just had some. She had some really good. It was nice to see the honesty too from her, saying, at the beginning I thought this. That Fauci was on the right path, but then after looking at the science and changing and looking into it and adjusting the point of view and changing my direction, rather than, it was interesting, Dr. Stack would say, well, we didn't know everything or whatever, but they still have the exact same mandates implemented that they have all the way along. They're not willing to change and adjust to the science.
Yeah, that was weird.
That's the thing. And then she, the one lawyer there kept saying, schools aren't closed, as if the schools were never closed. And
there's schools closed.
They were closed and closed and closed for a long time. And are schools closed now? Well, no, they're not. But that doesn't unclose the 6 months that they were closed.
Well, let's be clear. Jefferson County was closed up through March, right? I mean, we went into court in Boone County to get an order to put them back to school 5 days a week. They were 2 days a week in Boone County. Got that order, and then the legislature passed House Bill 208 and sort of, and I'm critical of House Bill 208, but, it did have the effect of putting Jefferson County back to school versus putting Jefferson County into a lawsuit over having to go back to school. I thought, clubbing these people over the head was the better approach versus, sort of the carrot. But, that's just me. I'm always for the clubbing them over the head. But, I thought Dr. Rutherford did well, and I think she was qualified, and I love the Master's in Public Health coupled with the MD. I thought she was a good witness.
Yeah, so. No. And then we had the mask expert, which did, Steve Petty, mask expert, who is a
He's one of the top certified industrial hygienists in the entire country.
And to sum up his testimony, to sum up his expert testimony, and it was long, and he had a lot of science there, and this is what it was: masks don't work. That was his
Masks
testimony.
don't work. The particles of the virus are really small. They're aerosolized. They're going to sit there like the dust in the sunlight, and they're going to be in the air. And
He said it took days for them to fall. Right?
Days
for them
Days to fall
Masks
from
don't
a
work.
height of 5 feet to the
You
floor.
need a good HVAC system. You need to open the windows and provide the ventilation and clear that stuff out. This is testimony.
Right, and that was the crux of his testimony, and he
And the 6-foot rule doesn't work for the same reason.
and the 6-foot rule doesn't work for the same reason. Now, what was interesting,
The 100-foot rule does.
the 100-foot rule does. Well, if you just stay home and call people, you know.
Save lives. Stay home.
Exactly. That was my question. All these people
Stay
get mad at me. I'm like, why are you going to the grocery store in the first
Yeah,
place?
what are you doing?
I mean, Instacart's a thing. Anyway, so
Bring the Rona to you?
right, exactly. Well, it doesn't survive on surfaces now,
Oh, yeah.
but that doesn't stop people from wearing gloves.
Okay.
But they're following the science. Anyway, so what was more interesting about his testimony, though, was the cross, because the cross was fascinating. Because not only was he, would you call it combative? Is that the term you
He was
use?
not combative. He was
Not combative. He was direct.
He had the professor mode on and dealing with the cross. I thought he did.
He did a fantastic job with the cross.
Yeah, he did.
Regardless, he was in a discussion with the lawyer. There's some heated moments with Amy Cubbage out of the governor's office. He clearly had been through this ringer a few times.
Mm-hmm.
I think he's testified in 400 some cases.
He's testified in 400 in some cases. And he literally sat there through the cross, and there's a lot of contentious moments where they try to catch him up. There was some times where one of my favorite was when they were referencing a guideline about masking, and he said, yeah, I'm kind of familiar with it. And they said, well, it used 12 studies in there about masks. He goes, well, no, it used 3 studies about masks, 12 studies total in it, but only 3 actually dealt with the efficacy of masks. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this guy knows what
He
he's
read 'em all.
talking about. And so it got to the point that, and I don't know how common this is, Amy asks a question, Cubbage asks a question. There's an objection to the question, and she's got to reword it. And the judge is like, reword it. And she leans over to her guy, and she talks for a moment. And then she just is like, I'm done, and sat down.
So let me say this. Amy Cubbage is a really good lawyer, and I'm here to tell you that. I actually have a lot
I know
of
you're a
respect
big
for her. I don't need to agree with her client, and I don't need to agree with her causes. I mean, she worked at a large law firm. She, I don't even know if she remembers this. She and I had a case together in 2008 or 9 downstate. It was a case. She was a Frost Brown Todd at the time, I think. And then she went to work for the ACLU. She's like the left version of the cause lawyer, kind of like I am. But I will tell you, I think Amy's a good lawyer, and a good lawyer knows if you got a tough expert when it's time to sit down. And I think she made that call, and I think it was. I mean, so when she started her cross, Richard probably heard this. Tom Bruns leaned over to me and was like, "Let's see how big of a hole she's going to dig," because we knew Steve Petty, who was the IH expert, was going to do really well. Of course, he did.
Mm-hmm.
And she, I think she took some shots at him, and she just realized that he was prepared. He wasn't going to budge. She did what a good lawyer does, which is sometimes you just got to sit down with a witness like that.
And I think importantly too, on their expert they first call, which is Stephen Stack, they can't even rebuke his testimony about masks. Because one, Stack wasn't even entered as an expert witness.
Right.
And that was interesting. He was only offered up as a
Fact witness.
As a fact witness on what the Cabinet of Health and Family Services did and could do, and how HB1, SB1, and SB2 could affect that.
Right.
But he had a lot of, I don't know if you'd call it explosive testimony, but he said a lot of interesting things. I mean, he said
a lot of things.
He said a lot of interesting
What did you find
things.
interesting?
Well, I found it interesting how seemingly unknowledgeable he was. That's what I mean by interesting. There's one point where you'd asked him, about saying, according to your website, there's been 2 deaths under 20 of the thousands upon thousands of cases in the state, correct? And he goes, "Oh, I'm not familiar with that." It's like, it's 2 deaths. How are you not aware? Like, you've been living, breathing, and eating COVID for the last year. How are you not aware about the 2 deaths out of the thousands of cases?
We also didn't know that how long it's been under a 5%.
He also did not know that. He also then made like a weird argument that paying attention to positivity rate doesn't matter, even though the
there was something of positivity, a percentage, and he tried to school the AG's office.
But there was a lot of opening though that was tied to positivity rates, wasn't there?
So that's been a metric that they've used to make public health decisions, I think, for some period of time. But I think, when pushed, that was another one of those where he was a little cagey. And I think, Vic's a good trial lawyer from the Attorney General's office. They set up Vic, Aaron Saletta, Heather Becker, they're great lawyers too. And I think, he was as cagey as he could be, with Vic kind of going after him. And, I thought Vic did a nice job.
He was certainly, you had, where he said the national government was, because he was asked how many were recycling our PCR test.
Yep.
And he was like, I don't know. And the AG's office was like, how don't you know? He's like, well, the federal government has told testers to not tell us and say how many cycles they're testing it, which is shocking when you consider that if you cycle too high, you're guaranteed almost always to get a false positive. So it's almost like you can manipulate the positive amount of positive and negative cases without anybody being aware of how you're doing it, right? It certainly seemed, I don't know. What are some of your highlights from it?
So Dr. Stack and I have had a lot of go back and forth. I think, this is the 3rd or 4th time I've cross-examined him in the case. You could tell he wasn't real happy to be there, right? Clenching, the fists right as I was standing up. We've gone back and forth. We did that deposition last summer. It's been used to club him over the head in a couple pieces of litigation. And I think,
what was that favorite line of yours? He's like, "Oh, that's one of your favorite lines of mine."
So I'm not the one that elicited the testimony. His own lawyer did over the summer that the Attorney General's office has been clubbing him over the head with ever since, as have I, every chance we get. That he and the governor have been issuing orders of breathtaking scope and implication, right? And so, which if you're proud of what you've done, which he was when he started that testimony over the summer, he was happy to own that until it got used against him to sort of say, look at everything you're doing. Oh my gosh, you're sort of a one-man law unto yourself, which is the other side of it. So, so that line has been quoted in extensive briefing in different contexts, and I think he's sick of seeing it. As you saw,
he kind of said something weird like, imitation
scope
is the best flattery. And I'm like, Chris didn't say that. He's quoting you. What are you talking about? Imitation, he's just quoting you, right? That's something different. Any other key takeaways you had from that?
So, I don't know if you guys caught this. I got Dr. Stack to admit that basically all of his orders have pros and cons and implications to it. Did you catch that?
Yeah.
And then I asked the follow-up. I wasn't sure if he would agree. I said, reasonable people can weigh those benefits and costs differently. And he said yes. I think that's the end of the governor's constitutional challenges because fundamentally the legislature sets the policy and the legislature has weighed the pros and the cons differently than the governor's office, at least in terms of the economic impact, getting people back to work, getting Kentuckians back to normal, getting them, getting the kids back to school. I think the legislature has had different priorities than the governor. And I think that testimony, when he said that, I don't know if you caught Tom Bruns, who was sitting right next to me, and Zach, but they were both like, that game, set, match, right?
Right.
Because, if it's a policy dispute and there's a rational basis for it, clearly there is, because he admitted people can weigh these pros and cons differently. I think that's the end of the game.
And there was one point where he'd ask him a question and he just responded with a little short jilted no. And I forget what the question was, and I know everybody else on the court was like, what? How's that just a no? Do you remember what it was?
I don't. I'm sure we'll pull the video. And,
We can pull the video at some point. Look, but there's one point. It's just real weird. Do you remember what I'm talking about?
I don't remember what the question was, but I remember he did it. That was his answer a couple of times. It was just like, okay, you said this. It was just like, no. When you were using his own words or his own a report that they had produced.
That's when I brought his prior testimony out and I started impeaching him with it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember that.
And you got close with your mask, and he wasn't wearing one. What was the deal there?
He's been vaccinated. He thinks he's safe. So, I don't know. I wore the mask because I've been vaccinated, but even if I wasn't, I just think, having just presented evidence about masks not being effective, wearing masks, I thought was a little whatever.
Did you see the sheriff deputy in the corner?
Oh, when he took the mask off after
the testimony's finishing, and he just goes, he's so pissed. He's like, these jerks have been lying to me for years. I'm sitting over here in this corner wearing a mask, listening to boring court cases all day, and I've been wearing this dumb mask. And here's this guy that just tells me it's all BS.
Dr. Stack and I have gone round and round in a couple different forums in a couple different contexts, and I think if you asked him deep down, I would say that he probably really, really, really doesn't like me.
I really, really, really don't like him.
Deep down.
It's actually really really close to the surface.
Yeah, if you think about it, I think clearly I've gotten under the governor's office's skin on a number of levels, right? There she is mentioning protests. The governor's lawyer, Mr. Wiest, got an injunction about protests. I don't know if you remember that.
Yeah. Where you were
clearly,
Molly was talking about protests being handled differently.
Yeah, and clearly I think I have frustrated them to a large degree with all of this, right? I think 4 or 5 federal lawsuits, a couple in state court, and I'm glad we were able to do it. But with Dr. Stack today, just my sense, he has delivered fairly compelling testimony in a couple different contexts, over the last year. And I just didn't feel like he did that today, like he has in other contexts. I know you guys haven't seen those other contexts. You weren't here last July when he testified. You didn't see the deposition. I felt like
I've read it.
Yeah, I felt like there was. I had to really work to get stuff out of him last summer. In that deposition, and it's just different now. He's every time he testifies, his story gets pinned down a little more, and it generates a little bit more for people like me to use against him next time he testifies. So, I don't know. It wasn't the firebrand Dr. Stack that I saw last summer about everybody's going to die. I felt like we effectively, between the vaccine and everything else, sort of pierce through that, and there's almost this admission of, the public health stuff's over, but we still want the federal dollars, and so the governor's not going to lift the emergency. That's what I heard today.
Right.
He uses a lot of words, and when you use a lot of words, well, sometimes they can be used against you, and I think that's maybe one of the weaknesses he may have.
I think that may be true. Well, guys, I don't know.
Thanks for coming.
You guys want anything else to cover? No? Okay.
No, we should get a quarter next week, and I guess the next thing I've got to do is another court hearing with you against the ABC Friday.
Yeah, ABC Friday. That'll be broadcasted probably live as well.
Oh, boy.
I think we're doing that one via Zoom, right?
I think so.
We're doing that one via Zoom. Have you already disclosed witnesses in that one or not?
I did.
Oh, okay. So I'm supposed to be actually testifying too, right?
You're going to be testifying.
Okay. Are they going to ask if I can read?
Well, it is ABC, right? You're against the ABC.
ABC.
Oh.
But I can do well with 1, 2, 3. I can do math problems.
Okay.
For them, something. But anyways, well, thank you guys for joining us so much. Check out the podcast. If you're catching this on replay, I should have said this at the beginning. It's a podcast, Apple, Spotify. As always, share it.
So just real quick before we wrap, I know a lot of people have been asking. I think we'll have a court order next week. I'll upload it as soon as we get it. I think, there's one more round of briefing. Everybody gets to file next Monday, and then I expect to get an order out of the judge by the end of the week.
All right. Congratulations. Great day.
Yep.
No, thank you for, always your willingness to sort of, both you guys, willing to slug it out. You can't do lawsuits without people willing to stand up and fight. So that's a fact.
Well, thank Chris. Thank you guys. Have a great evening, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.